Hi, my name is Hermann Lotze-Kampen and I speak for the Food System Economics Commission, in short, FSEC. We are an independent academic commission to support people who want to transform the food system. We will provide integrated economic evidence and recommendations to support policymakers, companies, and maybe you when deciding which pathway to take.
My name is Stella Nordhagen. Our current way of producing food follows the principle, produce as much as possible, as cheaply as possible. We raise animals in factories and use large amounts of fertilizers and pesticides on increasingly large fields to raise yields and lower prices. Additionally, most current agricultural policies favor large-scale, capital-intensive farms over smallholder farmers.
This has many negative consequences that we call hidden costs of the food system. River pollution is one of those side effects. Others include deforestation and loss of biodiversity. More than 700 million people don't have enough to eat, and even more cannot afford a healthy diet. Instead, they eat sugary, fatty, and salty food, which can lead to health problems such as diabetes or heart diseases.
But how can we achieve a food system that's healthy and fair for people and for our planet? We at FSEC think that in order to come up with useful advice, we have to look at the food system with all its dependencies and interrelations with the economy, climate, finance, public health, the political system, and more.
Some of us focus on food production and environmental impacts. Others on dietary change and health impacts, or on policy instruments to guide the transformation. By bringing together our respective disciplines, we are able to explore possible pathways for food system transformation on a global scale.
However, future pathways based on computer modeling alone are insufficient to tell us what's needed to achieve the required societal changes. We also have to identify the right policy interventions. That's why we're also reviewing agricultural and food subsidies, taxes or regulations that exist in all countries around the globe, their effectiveness, and also why it's so hard to change them.
In short, we, the Food System Economics Commission, take different perspectives into account to come up with feasible recommendations on how to transform the food system so that it's nature positive, healthy, and fair.
Our findings will support policymakers, companies, and people in their decisions on which food system pathway to take, both globally and nationally, into a future that's good for people and for the planet.
Hello and how do you do, and welcome. My name is David Nabarro, and I am absolutely delighted to be here with you all today at this very, very important seminar. And we've got a really exciting panel, and I'm in a minute going to introduce our panel members. And I very, very much indeed like to acknowledge and appreciate all the panelists who have come along today and who are participating in this vital event. I think the best thing that I can do is to limit the amount of time that I talk for, and instead to hand over and give you as much time as possible to hear from our wonderful panel. And so without more ado, I'm going to take us into it. You see, it's very, very important that I say at the beginning that the Keough School of Global Affairs has set this up as a virtual side event of the Borlaug Dialogues. Please do feel free to say hello in the chat and to let us know where in the world you are joining from. The theme of the Borlaug Dialogue this year is harnessing change, and as this record-breaking year has shown, we are indeed in dire need of change. The hidden cost counter that you've seen on the screen shows the immense financial resources that are wasted on damage caused by the externalities to the food system, externalities related to health, to labour, to the environment, to climate and other factors. And indeed, it's the accumulated costs only counting since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2016 that are so huge, and they increase by $50 million every 5 minutes. And the hidden cost counter that you've seen is a powerful reminder of how food systems have been considered outside the remit of climate discussions, out of bounds, so to speak. And this year at the UN Climate Change Conference in UAE, in Dubai, will be a really important opportunity for integrating and centering food at the heart of climate discussions. Bringing ambitious climate targets into the realm of the reachable is only one of the benefits of food systems. There are many more, as the hidden cost counter reminds us. But how can we make transition that will be just and will make a difference to people and to the planet actually happen in practice? And what's at stake? Well, with the help of an excellent lineup of speakers, we will all leave this webinar more knowledgeable about the hidden costs of the food system and the need for policy innovations that can help shift the hidden costs of the current food system into something that supports the global transformation and ensures healthy, environmentally sustainable, and economically accessible food for all the people on the planet. If you have questions during the presentations, please make them clear to everybody. Post them using the question and answer function below, and we will address as many of them as possible when we come to that part of the webinar. And if you wish to revisit the webinar on a later date, the recording is going to be put onto a link that will be shared with you. Well, I'm awfully sorry for taking so long in my introduction. And what I'd like to do is to move quickly to Professor Ravi Kanbur, who's one of the 3 co-chairs of the Food Systems Economic Commission. He's T.H. Lee Professor of World Affairs, International Professor of Applied Economics, and Professor of Economics at Cornell University. He's served as a senior staff member of the World Bank, including as chief economist for Africa, and he's published in the leading economics journals and held a number of key positions related to the sustainable development and economic dimension of the future. Ravi, as the hidden cost counter illustrates, it's clear that the course must change. How has the Food System Economic Commission worked to ensure that that change will happen? And how does policy innovation come into the picture in a way that is inclusive and just? Ravi Kanbur, Professor, over to you, sir.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, David. And thank you to the organizers for putting this together, to the Keough School and indeed the FSEC group. It's my honor to co-chair this commission together with Ottmar Edenhofer, who's co-director of the Potsdam Institute of Climate Change, and Vera Songwe, who till recently was the head of the Economic Commission for Africa. As was said at the start, the role of the Food Systems Economics Commission is to bring an economics lens to bear on the assessment of the global food system, the evolution of the global food system, focusing in particular on 3 key dimensions: environmental dimensions, the health dimension, and the inclusion dimension. And you know, when we do this, we look at the current operation, the current business as usual scenario of the food system. We look at an alternative scenario. We ask the question whether an alternative scenario, which is better along these 3 dimensions of environment, health, and inclusion, is biophysically feasible. And we then ask the question: does it make economic sense? Does it pass economic cost benefit tests? And finally, we then ask the question: how would this scenario come about? When you look at the hidden cost counter, the market value of the food system, roughly speaking, there are different ways of measuring this, of course, different technical ways of measuring this. The market value of the food system is, roughly speaking, $10 trillion a year. But the point is that the social value of the food system? Actually, it's not, because there are social costs, as David alluded to and others alluded to. There are costs, hidden costs. There are externalities that the production of food, the consumption of food brings to the table. And these have to be calculated in different ways, and there are technical methods of calculating these, and we do that. And that's what leads to the hidden costs calculator. I should also say that when we look at inclusion, the inclusion dimension, if in fact the food system, even though it produces $10 trillion worth of stuff in the aggregate, if in fact people who work in that food system live below the poverty line, we ascribe the gap between their income and the poverty line as a hidden cost of the food system. It is a hidden cost because we don't see it. It doesn't appear in the aggregate and the aggregate numbers. Similarly, when there are emissions as a result of food production, and that leads to social costs, those have the economic costs of that have to be calculated. And really, that's what leads to the economic counter, which you see clicking away there in front of you. Our analysis shows that indeed an alternative pathway. Well, first of all, it shows that the current pathway is leading us to disaster, is leading us to very bad outcomes in terms of environment, in terms of health, and in terms of inclusion. But it also shows that there exists an alternative pathway, and I'll come to the policies that may lead to it, which is biophysically feasible, but also it passes the standard economic cost-benefit tests. So not only is it that it's feasible, but that it also passes the economic tests as well. And that's the role of the Food System Economics Commission, to look at the economic viability of alternative parts. Let's talk then about the sorts of policies that might bring about this alternative path. And the technical details are going to be present presented in our reports. The sorts of policies, and my fellow panelists are going to be talking about some of these policies. One category of policy shifts which can lead us onto this path is shifting consumption patterns towards healthy diets. And Rachel is going to be discussing this element of it. Another dimension of it is that we want to reset incentives by repurposing government support for agriculture. Agricultural subsidies are a major fiscal issue for governments, but also they can cause environmental damage, and they're problematic in those dimensions as well. So repurposing these subsidies is another major policy tool that we have for setting the food system's evolution onto a path which will achieve good outcomes on environment, on health, and on inclusion. Another class of policies is to reset incentives again through policy packages like taxation of key emissions like nitrogen. Okay, designing policies which can affect those sorts of emissions and therefore have reduced the hidden costs. And then fourthly, a fourth category of policy interventions is innovate, and Paul Winters will discuss this, is to innovate to increase productivity and livelihood opportunities, particularly among smallholders. And this is a fourth category of interventions. And finally, a fifth category of interventions is to scale up safety nets to keep food affordable to the poorest, because many of these changes that are going to be good for the planet as a whole may well have inclusion consequences. They may well have some employment losses as shifts occur between sectors, and we have to take on board these possible negative consequences and have safety nets in place in order to address those issues. So those are the sorts of policy levers that the Commission looks at in detail and is discussed in its reports. Let me now just conclude by talking about two things, which is to do with institutional innovation. In order to implement these policies, in order to put these things in place, we're going to require various types of institutional innovation. And I know that Becca Jablonski is also going to be talking about some aspects of innovation to address resilience questions. But let me take up two of these types of issues, which are very institutional in nature. Okay, let me take one at the global level and then one at the national level. You know, at the national level, food policy in general is actually siloed in different ministries. You have agriculture, you have water, you have health, you have this, you have that. And then that makes sense in some respects. But what we need is a way of bringing all of these things together. And one way to think about these things is perhaps to have a unit in a central location like the Prime Minister's office or the presidential office, which coordinates these things, because you can't have food policy being done separately and differently and yet achieve these overall overarching goals. So that's a sort of an institutional innovation, institutional reform that's going to be needed at the country level. And of course, it'll be different country by country. It's not the same in every country, etc. But we have to begin to think about those things. Let me then, my final type of thinking about institutions is to do with the global setting, and where these policy reforms that are being recommended are going to have major consequences across countries, across nations. Some countries are going to lose out as a result, particularly in the short term. And the question is, how does one address these issues? And certainly having funds for compensation, funds for restitution is going to be quite important. But an institutional question is, where is that fund to be located and how is that fund to be managed? And there we have a tension between having a separate, different institution or these funds being managed by existing institutions. The current discussions about the climate fund, for example, should it be located in the World Bank or should there be a separate institution? I think these are the issues where the global policy community will have to discuss and come up with policy innovations to actually implement this class of policies that we're putting forward. Let me stop there, David, and let my fellow panelists take up the remaining questions. Thank you.
That was absolutely great. 5 policy levers, 2 major institutional shifts, 1 national, which I really understand what you're getting at, and 1 global, which is full of some very interesting challenges. Very, very helpful start. And now, Ravi, if it's okay, I'd like to move to our next panelist, who is Rachel Nugent. And Dr. Nugent is going to give us a bit of a presentation now on some of the nutritional aspects of this question. Rachel, all I would like to ask is that you talk for no more than 5 minutes, just to help us keep it roughly on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the Borlaug Dialogue for the invitation. I've put my timer on, so I'll see if I can comply with your request. So the question here is about how to improve people's diets. And I know that this is a sophisticated audience. You all are pretty familiar with the numbers, but just let me mention a few just to place us on the same page. 690 million people are still undernourished in the world. That number went up during COVID. It had kind of flattened out, but then it went up during COVID. 340 million children who have micronutrient deficiencies. More than 2 billion adults who are living with overweight or obesity, and the numbers of children and adolescents experiencing overweight and obesity is soaring almost everywhere in the world. Healthy diets are unaffordable for more than 3 billion people in the world, according to FSEC's research. And we have strong indications, both epidemiologically and individually, that diet is the single most important determinant of a healthy and productive and long life. So this is really important. We all know it. The people here in the audience, thank you for joining us. You know it too. A diet that is poor at a young age, a diet of insufficiency stunts growth, both physically and mentally. A diet of excess sugar, salt, fat, and processed foods combined with insufficient fruits and vegetables throughout life results in multi-morbidity chronic disease. There are many healthy diets. There isn't one. We have the Mediterranean diet, the Eat Lancet diet, the Planetary Health diet, and the Healthy Reference diet that FSEC is using for its work. And the important thing is to recognize this diversity, and that wherever someone lives, they should and can be exposed to a healthy diet. Now to the question that David asked me. I want to just touch on very briefly first some of the existing policies that should not that are not being conducive to an acceptable, affordable, and nutritious diet. And again, it's happening all over the world. Ravi mentioned some of them very briefly: subsidies for crops and livestock, industrial fish farming, palm plantations, and many more that lead to price distortions, excess production, and industrial food manufacturing of products with a long shelf life, but that are unrecognizable as coming from nature, and that lead to chronic disease. We know that, we see it all around us, wherever we are. Take livestock. A greater than 50% reduction in global consumption would be required to achieve the healthy reference diet described in the Eat Lancet Commission, except in sub-Saharan Africa, where the average consumption is very close to the amount required for the healthy reference diet. So it's not that even in sub-Saharan Africa, people need to eat much more meat. And of course, in South Asia, where people don't eat meat, but elsewhere in the world, we'd need a reduction of meat consumption by 300 to 600% to achieve that healthy reference diet. But we're not talking about just farm policy. We should be thinking, and we should be talking about industrial policy, trade policy, intellectual property policy, even education policy, and so on. So David asked, what can we do? So to turn to the positives here, what can we do to ensure that people have access to a healthy, affordable diet? And I'll give you a few examples. Fortunately, WHO has done the hard work for us. WHO, World Health Organization, has offered us a list of diet-related best buys. There are 33 of them, like the opposite of the worst buys that I just described, that are evidence-based and cost-effective ways to improve diet. And countries can choose, and communities can choose from among these. For instance, and Ravi mentioned this, using tax policy to reduce consumption of unhealthy food and beverages. We have almost 100 countries that have instituted taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages, and the results are very good. There's still experimentation, but the results are very good to show that people are price responsive. They reduce their consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, and that leads to substitution of water and healthier beverages, and it also leads to lower risk of chronic diseases. Taxes can be highly effective at changing consumption and reducing the burden of disease. And there's a lot of emerging experience with taxes on, for instance, junk foods, on fats, and even on meat. And we have more to learn there, but it's a very, very effective and very, I would say doable, but I don't want to minimize the effort of implementing new taxes. But I think it must be a high priority. Then very briefly, some of the other best buys and policy interventions that we have quite a lot of experience with, where the evidence is very strong, can be done in many places. Restrictions on marketing, especially to children. That's not usually very controversial even. Product labeling, like the black stop signs I'm showing you here on many of the products here in Argentina, where I'm living, that advise people about what is unhealthy about the products that they're buying. Public food procurement policies, repurposing agricultural support we mentioned, and behavioral nudges, if you will. And I'll just finish up, I can talk later about some examples, but I'll finish up with sort of, that's the good news. The bad news is that what we're doing is not enough. The changes that we are seeing in the evidence are not big enough, and that we have to be much more ambitious about not only using all of the available policies, but also thinking more creatively about what can achieve greater structural changes. And that's a lot of what the Food Systems Economics Commission is aiming for. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Dr. Nugent, thank you so much. You know, everybody, Dr. Nugent works at the Research Triangle Institute and has actually been the head of their Global Non-Communicable Disease Center for many years, and actually led a Lancet task force on non-communicable diseases and economics. And so she's really well qualified to say, yes, it can be done, but goodness me, we've got to do an awful lot more. And that's where the levers on procurement, on behavior, and on a whole series of other areas that are so important need to be held high, because as Dr. Nugent said, diet really is the most important determinant of a healthy, happy, and long life for so many of us. And thank you again for such a clear presentation. Let's move to another Food Systems Economic Commission commissioner. This is Professor Paul Winters. He's actually Kiel Hesburgh Professor of Global Affairs in the University of Notre Dame, which is the home of the Keogh School of Global Affairs. And Paul, we'd very much like to hear from you now about how innovation is really going to make such a difference in this area. Paul, 5 minutes if you like, and if you could start now, that would be great.
Thanks, David. So there's a whole number of things that need to be done, and we've heard those from Ravi and Rachel. So you need a broader effort for food system transformation. But one of the key things too is to think about innovations and how innovations can be part of the food system transformation. We think that innovations is the more efficient use of resources, and if we want to get rid of those hidden costs, we need to shift towards doing other things. And one way to do that is to provide new innovations. Those will include things like Rachel is talking about, trying to nudge changes in consumer behavior. They'll include new technologies, new biological approaches, social innovation, so a whole range of things. The good news is that there are a lot of food system innovations that are out there, and we're progressing at an unprecedented rate. There's new technologies from digital agriculture, which provides information on weather, sustainable practices, prices, to sustainable processing technologies, from dietary additives or vaccines for livestock to reduce emissions, to enhance fertilizers using microbials that lower the use of synthetic fertilizers while maintaining or increasing yields. So there's all these innovations out there that can facilitate adaptation mitigation. The problem that we're facing is a couple-fold. First, a lot of those promising innovations are not reaching the scale and remain at the 10,000, 20,000 farmer level and not millions of farmers. For example, digital education, digital agriculture seems very promising innovation, but there's lots of little projects here and there, but they're not scaling to the level we like. So they're out there, but they're not being used. So we're not shifting our agriculture production system. The other problem, as you heard from one of the ones I said, is most of them tend to focus on production, and particularly production of staple goods. We don't have enough innovations that are focusing on a broader set of commodities, healthier diets. We don't have enough that's dealing with food waste, on logistics and distribution, nudging those food consumption, healthy diets. There's not enough integration of small-scale producers. We could do things to help clean cold chains to reduce post-harvest losses. We could support a shift to healthier diets. So there's all this set of possibilities out there, but we need to add to those possibilities and do a bit more. So overall, what this means is that we need to use policies to support the smart scaling of a broad range of innovations with a focus on everything starting from production and going to consumption, and consciously scaling those things to induce changes in the market. So the government can play a key role in this, and there's kind of three roles that we see in the report. Public investment can be an enabler, a catalyst, and a stabilizer to support innovation, development, and scaling. In terms of public investment, government spending provides basic infrastructure like agricultural research, but also digital platforms that can be used for production, that can use to facilitate private sector investment. Public funding can be a catalyst for private sector investment by creating accelerators or incubators of innovation, or using blended finance to kind of de-risk innovation in the food system. And public funds can be used to speed up innovation, the diffusion of innovations that address agriculture and climate change. And you could use things like market shaping instruments like advanced market commitments. So the bottom line is there's a lot of potential out there, but we need to build off that and expand on it. And we need a conscious policy that's going to help tip the scale to induce higher level of innovation and create some progress on hunger and malnutrition and address climate change. Thanks, David. I'll stop there.
Paul, thank you. And, I've known you for a bit, and I knew you when you were at IFAD. I now know you in Notre Dame, and I know you also advising the COP28 presidency on the key innovations that need to be taken to scale. It's really great to see that you are playing such an important role in the Food Systems Economic Commission. And indeed, what I will be asking all the panelists after we've heard from you all is just a little bit more on what is going to be the potential for making some of the shifts that you're all talking about, because that's what really matters, I think, is not just knowing what needs to be done, but how we can make it happen. And I'd like now to go to Dr. Becca Jablonski, who is co-director of the Food Systems Institute and associate professor at the Department of Agriculture and Research Economics at Colorado State University. Becca, if I may call you by your first name, in building a more resilient future, what new policies are essential to help the food systems around the world absorb shocks, overcome stressors, and mitigate risks? Over to you, 5 minutes starting now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. It's really wonderful to be here with everybody. And I hope you will all indulge me that I created a few slides, which hopefully have some nice illustrations. And I thought I would bring in a few specific examples from the US context, but I think also that resonate globally. So we've been talking a lot about these trade-offs between efficiency and resilience. And indeed, this is something that I think became sort of common language during the COVID pandemic. You know, the challenge in thinking about these trade-offs between efficiency and resilience is that we know that there is an optimal balance, but thinking about that optimal balance necessarily depends on what we're trying to optimize. And of course, we know that there are trade-offs across so many different types of dimensions. And so we really need to think through that. And I think one of the challenges in this type of work is that part of those trade-offs necessarily depend upon values that we're not necessarily all in agreement on. And that is a conversation that I think we may need to have more directly. Next slide, please. So in order to support more sort of resilient systems, you know, there's different types of debates and discussions happening around really what some of these negative externalities are that result from this reliance on more efficient systems that we have devoted our global food system to over the last many years. And though there is this debate that occurs, I think one of the things that is pretty well agreed upon is that consolidated or more efficient food supply chains hurt small and mid-sized farms. And maybe not even just small and mid-sized farms, but maybe those that have been historically left out of programs. So farmers and ranchers, in my case, in the United States, of color, and those that are beginning. And so in many ways, we can think about those folks that have been left out. And in part to respond to this, the United States Department of Agriculture actually has many programs, please advance the slide, that actually are going to try to support and to create more resilient infrastructure. So the most recent thing that's just been announced by the US Department of Agriculture is $420 million as part of this Resilient Food System Infrastructure Program. And really what this is doing is funding that sort of mid-scale, small and mid-scale infrastructure that helps to create market access for small and mid-scale farms, and again, to create this more efficient system. And this is one of many programs that have existed for a number of years. This is new, but many of the other programs have existed for a number of years. Next slide, please. At the same time, there are a number of different policies that are happening at local, state, federal, and regional levels across the world that are trying to also create enhanced market access. So basically, we have this more resilient infrastructure that's maybe small and mid-scale. We know that they can't produce or process or supply that food as efficiently, and therefore there's additional costs associated with that. Do we have or can we use policies to create markets for these kinds of products? One of the most pervasive in the United States is through the Center for Good Food Purchasing. As I said, many of our cities and institutions have enrolled in this program. So what happens through the Good Food Purchasing program is that there are requirements or incentives for these institutions to purchase under 5 different values, again, creating these kinds of market opportunities. And one of those values is around environmental sustainability. Next slide, please. But success of those kinds of programs and policies really necessarily depend on a number of different things. And with 5 minutes, I do not have time to go into what all of those are, but I wanted to highlight 2. The first is that the success of the policies depends on understanding that local context. So for example, some of the infrastructure investments that are happening to create these more resilient food systems are around local food aggregation or distribution or marketing facilities. We often refer to them as food hubs. Next slide, please. However, if there's an overinvestment in this kind of resilient food system infrastructure, we could actually have excess competition, which could make it so that these businesses are not economically viable, and it could have these negative community and economic impacts, particularly in rural places. Next slide, please. Another consideration around this local context is that the same types of policies have very different effects in different places. So if you look at the right slide where we have wheat production and dryland systems, where we have organic certification that may be incentivized right through this different types of resilient food infrastructure and these different types of values, we actually see that in those kinds of systems, you can't practice no-till. And so there could be these negative environmental impacts that occur from increased erosion or other things. On the left-hand side, this is some results from a recent project we did looking at the city and county of Denver that adopted the Good Food Purchasing Program. And all of this just to say that there are these trade-offs that occur based on these different types of incentives, the different types of infrastructure that are actually bringing the product to the market. Next slide, please. And so, I think one of the things I also want to highlight around this local context is that though these global models are really important and those global numbers are important, we also need to think about that those numbers do not necessarily reflect exactly what we might see occur in a particular place based on that particular context. And so I urge policymakers to really consider that local context and not assuming that the same kinds of policies are going to have the same effects in different types of places. So the last thing I wanted to say here is that engaging regional stakeholders in the process of coming up what these policies are is really critical. And part of this is because we know that the majority of the worldwide population lives in cities, that the people who live in cities are the majority of the eaters, and they have power in making and setting policy decisions. Yet most of the food that's grown and raised is coming from more rural places across the world. And so thinking about how producers respond to these different types of policies is really important because most of these producers are not just profit maximizers. So they're not just going to behave based on some of these more traditional market signals. And so where we have things like the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, for example, where cities are really trying to leverage these food policies, I think that has incredible power to shape and to make our food system more resilient. But we need to make sure that those cities are having the conversations in conjunction with those regional stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing, Becca, if you don't mind me saying so, because you were able to give us a very nice initial presentation on the challenges of trade-off making. And then you stressed that when you are applying innovations, particularly those that help small and mid-sized farmers, it's got to be context specific as well as engaging regional stakeholders. You've heard, everybody, from 4 extraordinarily skillful and competent people giving very clear presentations. What they've done is made it also evident to us why the work of this Food Systems Economic Commission is so important. I'm going to go now to the individual panelists again and say, in the light of what you've heard from your colleagues, and taking account of the fact that we are here in the Borlaug dialogue looking at very practical options for moving forward, what do you believe is the most important issue or issues, if you want to choose more than one, that will determine whether or not the kinds of findings that are coming through from your work can actually be implemented at the country and local level? I want to go into the implementation challenge, and I'd like to come to you, Ravi, first, and just ask you, in your thinking, briefly, what do you believe is going to be key for the kind of findings that you referred to in your opening remarks to be actually implemented? And then I'll come to other panelists in the order in which you spoke and invite you to build on what Ravi says.
Sure. Let me take this up, David, because I've sort of written about this in a broader context as well. So this is a little bit more broader and also more personal. I think in any of these big global set of issues, where in some sense we're looking at planetary aggregates going in the wrong direction, and then we put forward a set of seemingly sensible policies for those planetary aggregates to go in the right direction. We may argue that the planetary aggregates will go in the right direction, that's fine. But underneath that, there are a lot of distributional consequences of the aggregates moving in the right direction. There are definitely winners and losers. Even if over a 30-year horizon, everything works out all right, there could be a 30-year period of consistent losses suffered by groups of people. And I think there are two reasons to worry about that. Obviously, one is straightforwardly ethical. If those people who are losing are poor, we have to worry. But secondly, there's a political economy reason, because if we don't worry about that, the change simply will not happen. So I think this notion of taking account of the distributional consequences and designing policy in a way that addresses that ex ante, I think that is the key to, in my view, the key to implementation. And then when one comes to the dreaded thing of having a fund, an appropriate fund which will address these issues, and you can couch that in very many different ways. You can couch it in terms of new technologies being offered to different countries or whatever. But it has to be real money on the table, so to speak. So that's point one. And then point two, and I alluded to this in my concluding, and I'll say that and stop there. It's not simply having the money, but although that's central, it's how is that then going to be administered? Who's going to actually institutionally administer that? Because there's a political economy to that as well. So if we look at the climate fund discussions just now, for example, the question of whether it should be a separate institution or the World Bank, for example, that's a big divide, because the G77 currently does not think it should be the World Bank, whereas the US and the EU are pushing very strongly for the World Bank to be the institution which administers these funds. So there's a basic issue of global trust and global political economy in implementing these things. And I think those are, A, having the money, and B, how do you administer it, are to my mind, some of the big questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Global political economy, everybody. What a very, very important concept. And in the current geopolitical difficulties that are being faced in the world, the global political economy is a rather fragmented entity. And thank you very much indeed for bringing that up. And I think are you referring, when you talk about the fund on climate, to the debates about who's going to be the host of the loss and damage fund that was introduced at Sharm el-Sheikh last December? That's the one you're talking about, isn't it, Ravi? Yeah, and it's a very important issue. Go back to you.
No, just absolutely. And just to complicate the matter a little bit more, that's just a loss and damage fund in terms of climate. Yeah. We're now talking about a food system transformation, which will have its own costs and benefits. So that raises another institutional question of whether there should be a separate food system fund, transformation fund, or whether that should be somehow incorporated into, woven into this global fund, which also incorporates. So that's yet another set of institutional stroke political economy issues. I'll be quiet now and let the others.
Thanks, Ravi. That was brilliant. Rachel, you've been working on dietary shift for a long time, and you've got pretty good experience of what works and what doesn't work. So again, as far as you're concerned, a little bit of focus on what will determine whether or not the results of the Food Systems Economic Commission can actually be put into practice.
Thank you, David. Yes. And to take on your question about what can actually make change happen, and to keep wearing the economist hat that most of us on the commission wear, at least for some of our lives. One of the things that I think can be very useful about the profession of economics is to put the numbers in front of decision makers and to make it as clear as we can, just like the food costs of the food system counter that you saw at the beginning of the webinar here, to make it very clear to people that even if those costs are invisible, they're happening. And so, for instance, some work that we published just a year ago measured the cost across 161 countries of overweight and obesity. I mean, that is a new-ish issue on the nutrition, on the global nutrition agenda and the global food system agenda, but it is growing quickly, this problem of obesity and overweight. And of course, what concerns us is that then leads to not only challenges in life and shortening of life through disease, but huge medical expenditures. So there's a real cost, and we quantified that, and it amounts to 2 to 3% of GDP over the next series of decades, just the cost of overweight and obesity. So why did we do this? Because decision makers in countries want to know, is this important to me economically, and can I use these numbers to motivate policy change, to advocate for policy change. So for instance, we use that in countries, and Mexico is a good example. They came to us and said, can you work with UNICEF to tell us what the costs and benefits would be of trying to reduce child and adolescent overweight and obesity? We call it an investment case. And we showed that a return on investment of $72 per dollar spent of implementing a package of 5 actions to reduce child and adolescent overweight and obesity could save a very large amount of money, not to mention the health benefits of doing that for the long lives of these children that lay ahead. So again, with the economist cap on, I say, let's put the numbers in front of people. Let's talk about what they can save. And let's talk about what they're spending right now, even if those expenditures are hidden. And I think that can engage a lot of policymakers in thinking about how to make real change happen. Thank you, David. Over.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Everybody, this figure that obesity basically costs 2% of GDP, 2.19%, according to my searching. This is huge. And I personally, as somebody who's worked both in public health and in food systems, believe that the health care and economic consequences of malnutrition are just not taken into account when policies are being made. There are some who say that this is perhaps the biggest public health policy failure of recent years, is the failure to put into place the kind of interventions that Rachel just described to get that 72 return on investment. $1 gives $72 of benefit. There's nothing like it. Every treasury should be paying attention to that number. Let's go to Paul. Paul, I want to slightly change where I take you to, because we've had a question in from a participant in this seminar. The question is, which public institutions have the most potential to make a major shift in food systems, and how? Public institutions nationally, public institutions regionally, public institutions globally. You heard from Ravi that there is an absolutely vital institutional dimension to this, and from Becca that the trade-offs are all quite difficult if you don't get some degree of standardization on how these choices are made. So tell me, Paul, or tell us what you believe the important public institutional mechanism is.
Thanks, David. Before I do that, let me just jump back to what Rachel was saying, which I strongly agree with. You have to get this in front of decision makers, right?
Yeah.
And I think you said the key thing, David, the Treasury Department, the Prime Minister's office. I think part of the problem, and this gets to the questions about public institutions, is that those of us that work in agriculture and food have been talking to each other for a long time and not talking to others, and getting those numbers and evidence into other institutions that are not just in the ag, food, nutrition space is very important. What I'm hoping is that at this next COP, COP28, which you and I are both working with the group there, that this leaders' declaration around food will help to nudge people in the direction of doing
Explain what that is. This leaders, just explain what it is, please.
So as part of the COP, the UAE presidency is trying to get over 100 countries to sign off on a declaration that basically puts food as at the same level as energy, as something that we need to be concerned about for climate change. So it's not just adaptation, but a quarter to a third of emissions come from food, and we're trying to get leaders themselves to say something. The last COP meeting, one head of delegation mentioned the word food, only one. We're hoping in this one that we get over 100 saying something about food, and on the very first day them signing off in the declaration. This gets to the question about public institutions. What we need globally is those institutions like the World Bank that Ravi's talking about, any sort of food and loss fund, any funds that are put together actually consider agriculture and climate finance, right? Right now it's about 4%. So hardly anything goes to climate finance, even if you just look at mitigation, it's a quarter to 33% of emissions are coming from food systems. So it's important for the international public institutions, and then nationally the same thing is to get those numbers in front of ministries of finance, in front of presidents, prime ministers' offices, and those are the ones that are going to matter. The ministries of agriculture, ministries of environment are usually not strong. So we need a strong voice into the main decision makers and lots of evidence and keep pushing for this idea. So that's where we need to see some movement. Thanks.
And that's why this Food Economics Commission is so important, because it's going to produce the kind of evidence that will make ministers of finance think. And I have to come to you, Becca, and ask you about that little comment you slipped in, linked to slide 2, when you said that when it comes to finding the optimal balance and a trade-off is being negotiated, it depends on the values that determine where the line sits. And I'm just going to ask you, what is going to be necessary to get the value systems to align with the kind of recommendations you're giving? Is this through public education, parliamentarian education, working with ministers of finance, working with other academics, or something completely different?
You know, it's such an important question, and I don't really know the answer, because it just feels like from where I sit and the groups that I work with that we just have these incredible divides, right? And we aren't able to, I think, talk across different lines. And I was thinking about that with Ravi's comment around the distributional consequences, right? Part of this is, what are the distributional consequences that we're sort of willing to live with these policies? And I don't think there's agreement on something like that. I'd love to hear Ravi's response. If it's okay, can I quickly respond to Paul, the question you asked Paul as well?
Okay,
because
I want to try to do a Menti poll before we finish, but come in quick. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to say that I believe that the cities are playing a key role in this. I think in many cases, a bigger role than national governments right now in setting some of these policies. And I think we're going to just see shifts towards cities continuing to lead the way. In the US context, New York City is the second largest purchaser of food after the Department of Defense. They spend $300 million a year annually on food. And it's not just in the US context. I mean, I've been working with Copenhagen or Nairobi. I mean, it's incredible the decisions that these cities are making. And I think the World Bank is really paying attention to that as well.
Brilliant. Wow. Cities. Well, we've got lots of opportunities here, but let's turn to you, the people who've joined us for this seminar. We want you to go to something called Menti, www.menti.com. Those of you who are looking at the chat will see the Menti poll there. If you click on www.menti.com using the link, the question should come up: what policy innovations give you hope for the future? I hope you've got that on your screen. Could you enter a word, perhaps using what you've heard just now, or perhaps adding something else of your own? And you're allowed to enter more than one word if you want to. I'll wait about a minute while you put some words in. Let me just, I don't want to, I mean, if you think it's pet food or something, write pet food in. I'm trying to not push you in any direction. But I think that it's now time to see what you've written. And so I'm going to ask whether or not we can end the Menti poll. Let's just see. And what we do is you can have the results sent to you. But let me see if there's another way of getting you access to the results, to see the results. Here we go. 29 responses, 30 responses. Cities leading the way comes right at the heart. No advertisement of meats. And then there are a number of other things put in there as well, including a meat tax. These are all very, very hot issues, all being looked at. Let me go across the panel now. You've seen the Menti reaction here. A last really short input from Ravi before we close. What have you thought as a result of this brief discussion we've had today, and also seeing what's on the Mentimeter? Ravi first, Rachel, Paul, and then Becca, and then we will close. Ravi, please.
Yeah, so many of these proposals are in the detail of the report. That'll come out eventually in a while. But when I look at them, I again see political economy written all the way through them. I see there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers, and how are we going to manage that process? I think that to me is the key. Thank you.
Thanks.
This is really important. Winners and losers. Rachel, over to you.
Sure, David, I'll jump right in. I'll say I think we need to try to build a global mindset among people, consumers especially, that demonstrates an expectation that we have a healthy food system, that we can live healthy lives, that we're not constrained by just the junk that we see in the stores around us, but that we can expect to live healthy lives and expect our policymakers to find a way to do it. And that requires action on many, many fronts, not any single or small number of policies. That we need to be much more ambitious. Thank you.
And governments have a role in helping people to make the right eating choices. Rachel's made that point. I want to say it as well. That's the point I would make. You can't leave it just to individual choice. You need to help people. Is that not right, Rachel?
100%.
Yes, wonderful work you've done. Paul, please, your thoughts and reflections.
I was going to say the same thing. Action on many fronts with government, civil society, private sector, consumers leading the way.
And that means, everybody, sometimes taking on those who say that the state should not be playing a role in helping people to eat well, and it needs care. And that's where the work of this Food Systems Economics Commission is going to be so important. To Becca, please, reflections as we close.
I agree with what everyone has said, but I just think that making sure we are working to rebuild trust across urban and rural stakeholders is really critical here, because I think sometimes when we have consumers lead the way, that it ends up with things like beef producers feeling like they've been alienated and are doing something bad, which is not necessarily the case. And so I just caution us in not having a focus on building that trust.
So everybody, you don't build trust by hammering people with whom we have to work. We've got to work with all the different actors involved, and that does require actually finding ways to work together. Otherwise, we'll never find the optimal balance that Becca referred to when she started her presentation. It's 7:31 here in Geneva. It's 1/2 the hour there in Iowa, where the home of the Borlaug dialogues. We've had the most amazing rapid fire discussion with some brilliant panelists. Also, really very well organized session. I'd like to acknowledge the work of Marius Wester and others in EAT for putting this together. But most importantly, could we all give real appreciation to our 4 panelists and really hold out massive hopes for this Food Systems Economic Commission, helping the right decisions to be made in the right context. With that, thank you, panelists. Thank you to the organizers. Have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.